love British Columbia, we love Canada, we love our history, our institutions, and our founding values, and we love this country. And we are worried. We are worried that our heritage is being squandered and ruined by people and very toxic ideologies. We have created also the Alqi Legacy Foundation thing. When I die, I can put money into a war chest, a fund for defense of Canada and British Columbia, and we also can use it to help fund other groups. So one of the most exciting things that we've seen in our time is this group called PLUS, Public Land Use Society. They have passion, they have great ideas, and they've got competent leadership. I mean, scary competent leadership. We need to get behind this group. We were so pleased to be one of the first major sponsors, and we want to say that anyone who donates and contributes to these guys before the end of December 31st will always be able to brag about being founding sponsorships. I want to introduce an amazing gentleman who's taken a real leadership role with the leadership team. We've got a number of the team here. Please welcome Warren Mirko.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Sam and Lynn, for hosting such a great event with such short notice, just under a month since it came together. And to many more supporters helping with the invitation list and helping invite the right crowd here. I'm pleased to see so many people, and we really respect your time, so I'll run through a disciplined agenda as quick as we can. And one day I'll make something tall enough for me, so I have to hold my mic on these small children podiums. So I'm Warren Mirko. I'm the Executive Director of PLUS, and my background's in strategic communications and regulation in the province. I'm Joined by Adam Pankratz and Caroline Elliott. If you could both just stand up. Adam is a lecturer in business economics and strategy at UBC Sauder School of Business. And Dr. Elliott is a political commentator and co-founder of Without Diminishment, and a senior fellow with the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. And we'll all be here afterwards for you to talk to and ask tough questions. We have another director, Jonas Rugo, who's a mine manager and mineral explorationist who's in the field, so he's unable to join us. PLUS is a provincial nonprofit society started just 8 months ago, and our mission is to ensure that decisions about land use, private and public, are lawful, transparent, and made in the public interest. And we've had a really busy year because all the decisions that have been coming out have not met that criteria. And so we've been hearing from groups that you represent, or either directly or indirectly with clients, industry, professional associations, recreation, and community groups, all concerned about the land use issues playing out in the province right now. And our interest and mission is really to generate public awareness and educate the public about what's happening to their interests, to their rights, and to generate public outrage, because that's the only thing that's proven to be effective in getting this government in the province to walk back on decisions that the public doesn't tolerate. Is when there's outrage, the government listens. And traditional advocacy and lobbying doesn't seem to be as effective. So that's why we're here. That's why this year we've been able to publish over 50 articles and participate on radio, television, and podcast events. And now we speak to city councils, board associations, recreational groups, and more every week, almost every day. We get requests. So that's what PLUS is about, and we need support to keep doing that because we only started, and look at all the progress we've had, and we keep getting calls and interest from people. So we're here today to discuss the growing divide between Canadian law and current government practice, and what that means for who actually holds authority over public land, private land and title, and governance of the province's landmass. And so with that, I'd like to turn to our speakers who have come to speak about this. I'm joined by Geoffrey Moyse on the left, is a former senior counsel and of the Legal Services Branch of the Attorney General's Office. Geoff is now a principal at Moyse Law. He's regularly in the media on podcasts and publishing papers, bringing attention to these issues, and has more than 3 decades of experience advising the government on Aboriginal law and Crown Indigenous matters, and he was appointed King's Counsel in 2013. And Thomas Isaac is with us here in the middle. Thomas is a partner at Castles, Brock & Blackwell LLP. He's the chair of the firm's National Aboriginal Law Group and co-chair of the National Major Projects team, and is nationally recognized as an expert on the topic of Aboriginal law. He's the author of the book titled Aboriginal Law in its 6th edition, in addition to 17 other books, his most recent being Canada and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'm not saying that acronym again, so that's UNDRIP from now on. And with that, I'll move to our questions and try to keep it timely. The structure today will be about 30 minutes of discussion with Tom and Geoff. We'll have time for Q&A, primarily for those who can't stay. And so if you have questions you're thinking of that are relevant for the room, you can ask them. Afterwards, we'll do a networking session. Tom, Geoff, and my team will be here to talk to all of you and take your questions. Okay, gentlemen, we have 4 hours of content and 30 minutes. So let's focus on brevity here. And I'll get my first question ready for you. We talked about this growing divide in Canadian law and what the province is currently unfolding in British Columbia, largely through UNDRIP. And I'm wondering if you could just talk to us about the difference here between what the Constitution says in terms of Aboriginal rights, land governance, and property ownership, and what UNDRIP implies, and how the government is interpreting UNDRIP, and what the conflict is to help frame out the situation for everyone. And maybe, Geoff, we'll start with you.
Sure. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk about Route 35 and Route 46. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because when I talk about Route 35, I'm talking about the Constitution of Canada. And Section 35 in the Constitution Act 1982 is the section that gave recognition, constitutional recognition and affirmation to Aboriginal rights and treaty rights, existing Aboriginal rights and treaty rights as of 1982. Route 46 is under. And they are not the same thing. They are very different things. Section 35, of course, is constitutional law, and UNDRIP is legislated into laws into British Columbia and into Canada. Now, what happened with UNDRIP, and I won't go into the history because you folks can Google the history of how UNDRIP came about. It was basically a process, a very long process under the United Nations, where Indigenous people around the world got together and decided on a human rights document. So that's what UNDRIP is. It's a human rights document. What happened in 2019 in British Columbia is UNDRIP was, I'll say, recognized in a piece of provincial legislation, and we refer to it as DRIPA, or the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. That is a British Columbia statute. It is not constitutional law, it is a British Columbia statute. As a statute, it can be repealed. So what happened in 2019 is the provincial government basically brought UNDRIP into the legislature and said, what we're going to do is a piece of legislation that says we will cooperate and consult with Indigenous people in British Columbia, and I would pause to say, nobody else. Under Section 3 of DRIPA, and we will consult and coordinate and cooperate with Indigenous people in BC to amend every law in British Columbia to conform to the principles or the articles in UNDRIP. Now, the distinction is, at least until the Court of Appeal says something different, which could happen in McKay now, UNDRIP is not the law in BC, per se. All it does is it provides a methodology for the province to amend legislation to bring it into conformity with UNDRIP. Now, the last thing I'll say in the introduction is we've seen some examples of how that's worked in British Columbia. The first example was the Land Act in 2024, where amendments were made to the Land Act to give joint and consent-based decision-making to Indigenous governing bodies, which is an undefined term in the provincial legislation. The reaction was, I think we could say, incendiary, and government was forced to withdraw that legislation. Then we had an election, and we heard about a pivot from the Premier. We're going to pivot. The pivot never actually happened. In fact, the pivot probably got worse. Anyway, so now we have the most recent, I guess not absolutely the most recent, but we've had the Heritage Conservation Act, which is the same process again. The First Nations Leadership Council and the government of British Columbia sit down and decide, A, what does UNDRIP mean? I'm a lawyer and I don't know what it means, so they make that up themselves. And then they take British Columbia laws like the Heritage Conservation Act and they say, well, we have to change this in order to bring it into alignment with UNDRIP. So I'm going to stop there. I just want you to remember Route 35, Constitutional Law of Canada, UNDRIP, Route 46.
Jeff, that was great. So I won't repeat anything. I'll try not to repeat anything that Jeff said, but look, Section 35, Canada voluntarily amended its constitution back in 1982. The people who put Section 35 in the constitution meant it to be an empty box. It was intended to appease the Aboriginal lobby. This is, I think, fairly well documented now. They were wrong. The Supreme Court of Canada took its purposive approach to the Constitution. By 1990, we start getting case law. We're now over 2 decisions per year in the highest court in the country. We've got thousands of pages on this section in the Constitution that, and again, I'm not an apologist for the Supreme Court of Canada. There's some problematic decisions. That's probably for another day. But in all of these cases, the court does talk about governments being able to govern. So it's highly dependent on governments taking a leadership role to make the tough decisions. Rightly or wrongly, we could argue about whether the Supreme Court of Canada did a good enough job or whether they've gone a little too far on some of the decisions, but that's the starting point. You jump over to UNDRIP and the myth about UNDRIP. So let me start by saying there are Indigenous folks on this planet that are dying daily. And UNDRIP was designed to try to deal with the plight of some of those people, particularly in some Central and South American, but other parts of the globe. The notion, and we hear this repeated constantly, that Canada somehow is behind the rest of the world. I want to be very clear, and I believe what I'm stating is a matter of fact. The light on the hill globally is this country. And probably many of you, corporate Canada, corporate British Columbia, or international corporations, you are in fact, and can rightly or wrongly, it's probably another discussion, leading the globe on protecting Indigenous rights. We are the light on the hill. So the myth starts on day one that somehow, well, Canada's lagging behind. We've got to catch up. It's impossible for Canada, the Northwest Territories, and BC. They all enacted similar legislation. I will say it. I've been very public the minute BC's Act came out. It is impossible for British Columbia to implement its own legislation. And there's an argument to say that BC is currently in breach of that legislation, depending on how you interpret it. I personally think it is. It's got a very clear commitment to amend, as Jeff has already said, every law, every regulation, with all 70 paragraphs of UNDRIP that uses completely different language than our tens of thousands of appellate case law pages from the courts. Well, you don't have to be the crunchiest chip in the bag to figure out, we're not going to be able to meet that standard, but think about what that does to reconciliation. We start on day one with a lie and a misconception about where we stand in the world, about how we treat Indigenous. I'm not suggesting we're done yet or anything, but it's true that we're on the right track as a country. But we've got to get back to more honest dialogue. So that's my sort of addition to what Jeff has said.
Well, that's a good segue to the next question for those of us that aren't constitutional law experts, to look at the impacts of UNDRIP, I think, that public land use society is seeing. So we've identified through people that reach out to us issues like airspace restrictions in the province, floating home license renewal uncertainty, dock license uncertainty, mineral claim moratoriums, Forest Service road shutdowns, parks being shut down to non-Indigenous peoples. And these appear to rely on claimed Indigenous jurisdiction or asserted territory rather than established law. So this seems to me to be the outcome of UNDRIP. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, look, I think Canadian law is very clear. The government of British Columbia, if it wants to be, is in control of the province from a jurisdictional point of view. There, I said it. That is the law of the land. Is it gray in some places? Sure. Would I like a bit more clarity? Would I like a few Supreme Court of Canada decisions to disappear? Yes. But generally, the court has been consistent in 70 plus decisions that ultimately is up to government to do the balancing, not the courts, not Indigenous peoples, not industry, not your job, according to the court. So UNDRIP has become a very convenient tool. And again, I don't mean to sound so partisan, but it's quite shocking to watch the lack of leadership and due diligence and really the lack of discussion around the public interest, when in fact, the public interest plays a key role in interpreting Section 35. Not so much on UNDRIP, though.
Do you use UNDRIP and DRIPA interchangeably? Sorry, just for context for the rest.
Well, no.
No, okay.
I mean, DRIP is the provincial legislation that attaches under. I would just say this. I was in the Federal Court of Appeal 3 weeks ago in Quebec, if you know that leading case right now in the interpretation of the federal statute. So I was there for Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, I might say quite proudly. And what became apparent in the hearing was the vacuous nature of the legislation. You could drive a truck through the federal legislation, and the BC legislation is even worse in terms of the empty promises. And by the way, most Indigenous leaders know this, but of course, you're at a negotiation table, so you do what you need to do.
So one thing I would say about UNDRIP, and I know Tom spends a lot of his time, I spend a lot of my time dealing with land-based, resource-based issues. So I wouldn't bother to talk to you about all 46 articles of UNDRIP. You can read them. But the ones that really get us riled up, I think, are articles like Article 26 of UNDRIP, which basically says if you have a traditional territory, you own it.
Yeah.
And you own all the resources in it. Period.
Yep.
There is no definition of traditional territory. It's whatever you say it is. If you're an Indigenous community, it's whatever you say it is. And if that's your territory, you own it. And you own all the resources in it. Now, Section 35 says no such thing. Section 35 says there's this thing called Aboriginal title, which has to be proven through a court or negotiated, hopefully through a treaty process. And that Aboriginal title is found to exist as of occupation of land, regular occupation of land, exclusive occupation of land, as of 1846 in British Columbia. Now, if you look at the Chilcotin case, we have a territory which is enormous. The Chilcotin territory is huge. The Chilcotin case produced an Aboriginal title finding of about 1,900 square kilometers. Now, that may sound large, but I would suggest to you the territory is probably well over 100,000 square kilometers. And so even then, the claim area in the Chilcotin case was cut down by half by the trial judge, who said, well, you didn't prove title in this part of the claim, only in this part of the claim. So the point I'm trying to make is Aboriginal title does not blanket British Columbia, every square inch. And I think, unfortunately, we have a government who have decided they like Article 26 more than they like Section 35 Aboriginal title.
So it sounds like through UNDRIP, nations that claim or assert territory are given all the rights and privilege as if they had title through the Constitution without going through the scrutiny of proving it through the courts or through a treaty. And I guess the question for this audience that I think is what are the practical, not legal, but the practical governance risks that arise for proponents or professionals, the public and landowners, when regulatory authority is exercised through these new agreements that are negotiated behind closed doors with the government and a First Nation that the public cannot see and cannot legally test. What are the practical outcomes of what we're seeing happen now?
Well, look, I'll take. It's a very big question. I'll take one angle on it, and that is that the lack of the public interest, what we sort of all take for granted in this country, or historically have taken for granted, seems to have gone by the wayside. And this isn't just in British Columbia. We're seeing this as the executive form of government becomes more predominant in all of our political jurisdictions. Unfortunately, our province is the poster child for it, where it's as if the public interest doesn't exist, certainly recently. And this is a problem in terms of regulatory bodies. So you will see, and I've had this argument with some elected provincial leaders, where I'm trying to explain to them at law that First Nations cannot look out for the public interest. They're not embodied, and it would be illegal for them. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their members. They must make decisions in the best interest of their constituency. Well, how could you ever balance anything? And so, I have, maybe not as publicly I've said it, but I'll say it here. I mean, it's negligent. It's just sheer negligence not to be insisting on the public interest. I was highly critical of the Haida agreement. Look, can you sign agreements? Sure. But the devil's in, I don't have to tell anybody in this room, the devil's in the detail. And when I see one line in the agreement of, well, the Haida are going to honor fee simple title, there. We're all good now, right? And it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous proposition. So this is the point, that if we don't do our homework and do this properly, final point, and I'll say it again, is BC picks favorites. So the government of British Columbia for decades now, so I'm not blaming just the EB government, has dealt with about 30, 40, Jeff, you might correct me, but 30, 40, we could arm wrestle whether it's 50. But the vast, we have over 200 First Nations. The other 150 are not part of this. They're not getting Haida agreements, and they're not getting them anytime soon. And we're going to run out of land and resources, as we're already starting to figure out. So my ultimate comment, and again, it's not exploring your question fully, is, and I've been a broken record on this for 2 decades, we better come up with a game plan and come up with it quick on how we're all going to get along together in this province, because the existing state of affairs is absolutely unsustainable. And I think we've reached that point where it's becoming quite clear to really everyone now. But we've seen it for decades building to this.
So I want to say a little bit about jurisdiction, because Warren brought that subject on. And of course, for those of you who are not lawyers, when lawyers talk about jurisdiction, they mean law, legal authority to make decisions, legislative authority. In the UNDRIP legislation, there is a section 7, which purports to allow the government to empower, jurisdictionally, First Nation governments, whatever those might be, and I have some real questions about what they might be, to jointly make decisions with the Crown, or to enforce consent before the Crown can act. Now that is an attempt at conferring a jurisdiction on First Nations communities. Everybody knows that reserve-based governance is a thing. It's the Indian Act. We know about the Seychelles. They have their Seychelles self-government agreement, under which they govern their reserve land. So there's examples of governance arrangements. Even on Haida Gwaii, the federal government eventually got around to saying the Haida Nation is a government, a genuine government. But what I would say is that there's a lot of recognition of Indigenous jurisdiction going on in this province with this provincial government, which is vacuous. It doesn't exist. Indian Act reserve governments do not have jurisdiction off reserve. In 1997, in the Delgamuukw case, Chief Justice Lemaire said he was trying to deal with a claim of self-government that was made in the Delgamuukw case. And he says, well, you know, as I said in Pamajuan in 1996, any claim to Indigenous jurisdiction that is claimed on a plenary basis, in other words, we are a government and we can govern our territory. He said that isn't cognizable under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. You literally have to prove it law by law under the Vanderpeet test for Aboriginal rights. And so my question to the EB government is, what is this jurisdiction that you are recognizing that every First Nation in this province apparently has over their traditional territory? I'd like to know where it comes from.
Good point.
So we're coming out of this answer with more questions. But that's why we're here, is if you're confused, it's okay to be confused and to take that back to your networks and raise these questions publicly. I'll just say, so PLUS has heard from groups with concern about the Heritage Conservation Act and amendments. And I'll just talk about land use planning agreements in the province. Like this year, there's a Squamish land use agreement. There's a Tahltan agreement underway. These agreements give joint or exclusive decision-making authority to First Nations by the province over asserted territory that's not proven Aboriginal title. It didn't get proven through court or a treaty, but all the rights and privileges that would come through that are now given through these agreements. And we're hearing concerns from industry and recreational groups throughout the province. That's about primarily public land, because everything you do on public land, from snowmobiling and quadding to looking for minerals, 95% of BC is public land. You can imagine what people do on that right now. It affects homes, whether you have an issue with your private property or not. You probably live near Crown land. Your property value is dependent on what you can do nearby in parks. The foreshore access you have, your dock is on public land. And the government keeps saying that private property is not affected by lots of these deals, but private property value and homeowners are certainly concerned or facing impacts from this. Let's transition to that and the Cowichan ruling on private property.
Start, and then you can go.
Yeah, so Tom, the Cowichan decision declares overlapping fee simple titles in Richmond, parts of Richmond, to be inferior, defective, or invalid, without getting into the details, when Aboriginal title is proven. What should landowners, lenders, investors, and property holders understand through the practical risk that this creates?
So I'm going to segue for Tom. Remember my Route 35, Route 46. The reason I call it Route 46 is there's 46 articles in UNDRIP. We are talking now Route 35. Okay, so we're talking Canadian constitutional law. We're talking about a declaration of Aboriginal title under Section 35. So this isn't about UNDRIP, this is not about politics. This is a court deciding a principle of law under Section 35. I think there are some of us in the room who think the court probably got it wrong. One of whom is sitting beside me. But remember, we're talking now about the constitutional law of Canada. So I wanted to segue that. This isn't about UNDRIP.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Look, I think practically, I'm probably in a room of experts really on the practical effects. I'm hearing all sorts of anecdotes. I'm reading the same media that you're reading. What I'm not seeing is leadership from our public governments. I think it's absolutely appalling that both our federal and the federal government has a role to play here. This notion that, it's not provincial jurisdiction. Well, we know that obviously the land title system isn't federal, but this is about the Canadian economy, it's about the BC economy, but the lack of leadership from the province is quite shocking to me in terms of dealing with the practical consequences. There should be a written statement that all the CEOs of the big banks can read, all of our investors read, about how there's only going to be one answer at the end of this. Either indefeasible title stays whole, or we will seek a constitutional amendment, because we can't have an economy in the global world without protecting individuals. You all know that. We have a lot of people in this province that do not understand the role that private property plays in the economic system. They think it's about your house, or you live in a nice house, it's too bad, you not understanding it. So yeah, we're seeing it. I first-hand knowledge of deals falling apart, personal effects on my properties they own, deciding not to develop or can't sell now. And so it's really tragic. And I'm not sure, the problem is that the court decided to not restrict its reasons to the 800 acres. And I want to be very clear, and I know there are a number of you in this room that are directly affected by the 800 acre decision. So I don't want to downplay the importance of that. But the as big an issue and the national issue is that the court could have limited its reasons and deliberately chose to use the word, I'm sure you've heard me say it 1,000 times, but a precedent flowing from the case. 6 different times. I've got a clipping from a former BC politician, an editorial last week, a former cabinet minister saying, well, there's things in the decision that look like it provides security to private property. What decision was he reading? Because it was not the Cowichan decision. The Cowichan decision does the exact opposite. So the practical effects are quite chilling. You all know we haven't fully felt them yet. We are just getting started. I think we are trying to keep everyone calm. I think at the end of the day, there is only one answer that we can live with, that the country can tolerate, and that is indefeasible title, still indefeasible title in Canada. And but our public governments, this idea of just sitting quiet over in Victoria or Ottawa, I think is shameful. It's absolutely shameful, and it also doesn't further reconciliation. This is the great irony of this, because they don't care. This is all about headlines, and I'm convinced of it now. I see it everywhere I look in Vancouver. It's headline, headline, headline. We don't have anti-jump bar. I've talked to a few people about our society, and it's all about getting the headlines. And we need a sustainable public policy, whether it's transportation, Aboriginal law, fee simple rights, healthcare, that will take us into the future and start making us California North again. That's where we need to be so we can afford reconciliation.
So let's talk a little bit about Haida. Because
for too long. Now for something completely different.
Just for a couple of minutes. Okay, so Tom has segued, in a sense, into Haida, because what happened on Haida Gwaii, very quickly, the Haida were in treaty negotiations about 25 years ago. I know this because it was. But they were in treaty negotiations, and I think they decided at some juncture that they didn't want to do treaty negotiations because they had figured out that they were going to get parts of Haida Gwaii as treaty settlement lands, but they weren't going to get the whole thing.
Agreed.
So they also went to court with an Aboriginal title case where they claimed the entirety of Haida Gwaii. That court case was moving along and went on for several years. There were discoveries and everything happening with that litigation. And I think at some point the Haida realized that that court case was a bit of a crapshoot, because the test for Aboriginal title, according to the Supreme Court of Canada, is not just exclusivity. Everybody can say, oh, it's just the Haida who are there. It's about regular occupation of land. Now, Haida Gwaii is actually 10,000 square kilometers of land and water. That's the area that's now been declared, thanks to the provincial government and the federal government and the Haida, to be Haida Aboriginal title. I don't think there's a chance in where that they would have been able to prove 10,000 square kilometers of Aboriginal title under Section 35. But what they did is they found 2 willing governments. They found the E.B. Horgan combination, and they found Justin Trudeau. And they talked the two governments into a deal where they got Aboriginal title, Haida title, to the whole thing, including surrounding water. That would not have happened as a result of the court case. So this was, I call this the biggest dupe that's ever been perpetrated in British Columbia. Now, to further that, they basically allowed the Haida title to be extended over private land on Haida Gwaii. And then they came up with some clever so-called theory that would somehow protect the private lands from the Aboriginal title holders. Well, when you actually work your way through the theory, it ends up being what Tom said a little while ago, which is it's a promise by the Haida that is not made to the private owners on Haida Gwaii. They are not parties to the promise. It's made to the government of British Columbia. So they have no privity, they can't sue on the promise.
Yep.
And if the Haida choose tomorrow to break the promise, then all of the private property becomes worthless because it is already subject to Aboriginal title. Now, the last thing I'll say, and this is the link to Cowichan, when Tom's talking about the judge in Cowichan making what I was always taught as a law clerk in the Court of Appeal was the fundamental error
Yes.
you never make as a judge. You never talk about anything for which there is no evidence in front of you. This judge decided to say that in every case of Aboriginal title declared under Section 35, that the Land Title Act of BC, Sections 23 to 25, which are the indefeasible provisions of your private ownership, do not apply. Now, shortly after this, the federal and provincial governments went into court with the Haida. This is like about a month later. They knew already from Cowichan that the effect of a declaration of Aboriginal title under Section 35 would mean the Land Title Act provisions that protect that private property do not apply, according to the judge in Cowichan. And they went ahead and went into court with the Haida, and they sought a court declaration to make that happen. So that's all I'll say about it.
I just have to say one thing, and that's after saying that they consulted, and I've called the Premier out on this, that they consulted with folks on Haida Gwaii, which, as I understand it, they did, on whether or not people would be in favor of a reconciliation agreement. I have yet to meet a private landowner, I'm sure maybe there's one out there, that was consulted on the Haida agreement itself and the acknowledgement of Aboriginal title on their fee simple land. And this goes to the bigger issue of the lack of transparency than sneaking into court and doing what they did. And this is after saying I was involved in meetings with numerous clients and some not clients. And then if you watch publicly, oh, we've heard all the concerns. We're going to take these under consideration. A lot of good comments. Didn't change a thing. So anybody sitting on the fence, go, well, it's at some point someone's going to wake up. You know, I say, you know, this idea that, well, there's no hand on the rudder. There's no rudder. But there's no game plan. It's one thing to have a game plan and not execute on it. This province has not had a game plan in 30 years on how this is all going to work. And that's what we should be insisting on. And I totally agree with Jeff's assessment, by the way.
So the last thing that comes out of his discussion is, again, we've got Route 35, and Cowichan is about Route 35, and I think that ultimately the Supreme Court of Canada will find a way to deal with protecting private property. I have no doubt. So that's on the one side, but on Route 46, remember that the Premier actually said that Haida is his template.
Yeah.
Remember that Josie Osborne, when she was Minister of Mines, said in a meeting with someone, I wasn't there, but it was somebody's attending. So this is hearsay. But she said, within 10 years, there will be no Crown land in British Columbia. Think about that. 90 some odd percent of the land base. What's going to happen to it? It's going to be turned over to Indigenous communities because the Premier believes in land back.
She did say, and was quoted in a legal case, I believe with Tyrannus Minerals, that First Nations are the rightful owners of the land in British Columbia.
Yeah.
As they sought a work permit and quoted her, and the government, rather than go to court on that, gave the permit immediately.
So we had Minister
I would just say shameful.
Murray Rankin walking around the province saying that all of us are settlers. We're all colonialists. We are all on stolen Indigenous land. And this was a minister of the Crown
Yeah.
saying this stuff, right? So the last point I'll make is one more point about UNDRIP. I think UNDRIP is probably, you can see UNDRIP on Haida. Give all the land back under Aboriginal title, and then carve out some sort of quasi-protection for private properties. So if you're a business and you rely on Crown land, I think that the long-term goal is to change your landlord.
So
That doesn't have public interest as part of their mandate at law. Yeah.
we're going to shift to questions in a moment for those who can't stay or have to leave early. But I want to just stimulate some thought for, we're talking about where things are going. Things are clearly fluid and changing right now weekly. It's given us a lot to write and engage in the media about. There are new land use planning agreements, consent agreements coming out nonstop. And there's going to be legal decisions that come out. What should those in the room and leaders representing clients of different backgrounds monitor over the next 12 to 18 months in this dynamic environment?
Well, my big concern right now is monitoring our investment, our ability to attract capital, retain capital. Maybe I'll start there, retain capital, and then if we're lucky, attract capital back to our province. That's something I'm keeping an eye on. We need public government leadership. I don't think we're going to get it. I think, I'm a person that looks at it, I get paid to try to be as objective as I can possibly be, and I don't see evidence of any changes happening, certainly at the provincial level, I will say. I would say that the jury's out on federally. We'll see. I think we're hearing the right things, but we'll see. But provincially, you look at the evidence to go, the exact opposite is true. These folks are hurling coal in the back of the train, and so that would be that. I think watching the courts, it's going to be a slow process. I've just gotten some recent updates that we're looking now into 26 before we see any material movement in the courts on this decision. I think it's absolutely appalling. I think the province should be taking a leadership role again and insisting on the parties getting together with the Chief Justice in the room and sorting this out. I know that's unusual in Canada. This isn't about interfering with our third branch of government. I want to be very clear. The courts need to be independent, but this doesn't mean you stay silent in an emergency. That's why we have these processes and have these institutions. So I think, and then finally, I would say, watch what the public does. I think, anecdotally, I'm hearing from folks I've never heard. People watching lawyers speak or listening to lawyers speak isn't something I usually come across very often. I usually get the glazed over look. But all joking aside, there's something going on like I've never seen across the country. Let's be very clear. I'm active, 7 days a week, and we're hearing stuff across the country. And I think being engaged. Final comment I will make is, and I've been advising folks I'm not, I don't tell business folks what to do with their business, but if anyone thinks nuance and subtlety will get you anywhere in this province, you're wrong. And you've been wrong for 2 decades. And I said it. And you have. Where nothing's changed. And now it's getting really bad. So speak up is what I would say.
So I want to say a couple of words quickly about reconciliation. The word of the decade. I don't use it anymore. I don't use the word Indigenous either because it comes from UNDRIP. I talk about Aboriginal relations. Aboriginal is the term that's in the Canadian Constitution, and so that's good enough for me. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission mandated, I think beyond their actual terms of reference, that UNDRIP was to be the framework for reconciliation in Canada. This is where this train left the station, ladies and gentlemen, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission saying, UNDRIP is the reconciliation framework that you have to use. In Tom's world and my world, we have a reconciliation framework. It's called Section 35 of the Constitution Act. It is a reconciliation framework that balances the rights of everyone. UNDRIP doesn't. UNDRIP sets out absolute rights, and a lot of them are inconsistent with Canadian law. And so my view is we need to ditch this notion that UNDRIP is a recipe for reconciliation. It is not, in my view, any such thing. And so then you might ask, well, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is, and has been, since I used to give this guy legal advice a long time ago, the answer is treaty making, which is what we were supposed to have done all along from the very beginning. We did 14 little treaties on Vancouver Island. Treaty 8 extended into the northeast corner of the province. And other than that, we didn't have any historically, but we now have, and I'm very proud to say I worked on the Niska final agreement. It was one of my first files, actually. We have Niska, we have Tawasin, we have Clam, we have 5 Manolfa treaties, we have Kitsum Kalum, we have Comox, we have Kitsless coming. Now, the magic of these kinds of agreements is that they balance. And the second point is they do not involve private land. Private land is never on the treaty table unless it's by willing seller, willing buyer. So they resolve the Aboriginal title question, because after the treaty is done, Aboriginal title remains in principle but not in practice. And so no more Aboriginal title litigation after treaty. The treaty sets out all of the lawmaking authority that will be exercised by the First Nation, by Canada and British Columbia, and some very, very clever rules as to how those are given priority. In some cases, it's First Nation priority. In some cases, it's Canada priority. In some cases, it's BC. So treaties, we worked on treaties together decades ago. They are still the best answer.
Yes.
The best answer that we have. And unless we get rid of Section 35 in a constitutional amendment, which I don't think is terribly likely, they're probably the vehicle we should be asking and insisting the government pursue vigorously.
Well, that is the best way to end part of this discussion, is having a path forward. It does exist. It's not easy, but it balances Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal rights. And there was an article out this week in the National Post about treaties being the process forward. There's articles by us and others out that you can look at through our website to catch you up on all of this complex material. And I guess I'd just like to say before we go to questions, there's a lot happening. This is dynamic. There's no end to this discussion today just because we end it. There are solutions that we can all go research and read about and advocate for, and advocate that UNDRIP not be the sole way for this province and country forward when it comes to reconciliation. And I guess I'd like to ask for questions, if you can hold questions for the discussion and networking, we're around for the next hour. That would be preferred, because we could be here for quite a while. But Mr. Sultan, Ralph Sultan, I see your hand up. Let's take a first question from you.
Thank you. I'm Ralph Sultan. I represented West Vancouver Capital Island in the legislature until about 20 years. And I suspect that Sam Sullivan and I are the only people in this audience, but I have to really look around the room carefully, who was present in the legislature was UNDRIP was made into law. And it might be helpful to understand the context and certainly how it was viewed by us who were not in the government at the time, but it was introduced by our friends across the aisle. And we viewed it as sort of a feel-good, yes, let's all try and get along together framework for continued reconciliation, to use the phrase of one of the speakers a moment ago. Ellis Ross in our caucus stood up and said, this is crazy. This law obligates the government to consult the Indigenous people, undefined, everyone I guess, on virtually every decision of government. This is nuts, it's not gonna work. And by the way, the treaty process didn't pan out because the most Indigenous people figured out they were doing very well without treaties. And Ellis made the case we're doing very well under rights and title cases in the court. So why complicate and possibly derail that progress by introducing yet another piece of legislation? We ignored Ellis's good advice. Ellis, of course, went on to higher office and currently represents the Conservative Party in the Parliament of Canada. And I would say, as a plug for a man who's come up the hard way in life, I would trust Ellis's judgment on Aboriginal issues more than anyone else I know. He has proven his merit by being elected a president of the Haida Nation. The LNG progress in British Columbia, I think, today owes a great deal of credit to Ellis's support. So Ellis's opinion, in my view, deserve a lot of weight. And he thought UNDRIP was a big mistake at the time. But because we were all propelled by what I'd call Jeff Plant, Gordon Campbell, let's, kiss and make up for the sins of the past, mood in the caucus, we said, well, I guess we'll support it, and it was unanimous. There were no dissenting votes in the legislature. But I point out the legislature has the enormous authority to create laws. It also has the immense authority to cancel laws. And I think this is one law in the books that our government should really seriously reconsider, because if the intent of the courts is to interpret the law as passed by legislators, certainly there was absolutely no discussion, maybe there was in the government caucus, but I doubt it, of the implications and how the courts might interpret this in terms of land use. Wow, that would have opened up Pandora's box, and I'm sure raised some eyebrows and thoughts of, wait a minute, what are we talking about here? So I think we see unintended consequences. And if I was a testifying court as to the intent of the law, certainly I would, with a clear conscience, say I had no idea that the court would seize a piece of legislation and run with it to the degree it passed, to the extreme detriment, I think, of our future. And I really get very upset about it. I endorse the idea that this is a supreme challenge for Canada. We cannot straighten this out. My goodness sakes, we can hardly call ourselves a country. So that's my view.
Thank you, Mr. Salter.
Existential moment for this province and this country. I hope you can stand up and be part of this movement. The thing that Lynn and I really love about these gatherings is when people meet each other. So please reach out, speak to other people that you see here, and where there's a lot of conversations that could go on. Thanks all for coming. Let's get behind Plus. Thanks a lot.